Welcome, everyone, to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. My name is Bob Kaler.
And I'm Jeff Markey.
We're the pastors here at Aldersgate, and we welcome you to this edition. We're in the midst of a series on the book of Genesis, and we are diving this week into the Abraham story.
It was awesome. Last week, I know you got a chance to look at the Tower of Babel and take some time there, but here we are in Abraham. And
yeah, we've moved from the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are generally considered to be prehistory. These are chapters that are not datable, really, but these large stories, and they're structured by this process in Genesis called the Toledot process. These are the generations of, or this is the story of. That kind of moves them along. So there are these sense of chapters that kind of fall within the story of Genesis. And we've come from those first 11 chapters, which encompass creation, fall, Cain and Abel, Noah, all the way up to the Tower of Babel. And now we're getting into more the historical part of the book of Genesis, relatively speaking, called the Abraham story. And we're getting into the idea of covenant more specifically.
Yeah. You've been talking a lot about covenant in this particular part of Genesis. What is a covenant? Could you explain a little bit more about why does God make a covenant with Abraham?
Well, I think God's covenant is about working with human beings. God intended to partner with human beings from the beginning. And that was part of the idea of creating them in his image so that they would reflect his glory, would reflect his wise rule over creation. And so God has not abandoned that project. He's still working with humanity, but it's an unequal relationship as it has been from the beginning. God is the powerful party. Humanity has a role to play, but it's a subservient role. And God provides for humanity, but at the same time expects something from humanity in return. And that whole idea in the ancient world of a suzerain, what's called a suzerain, the powerful person, and then the vassal, the one who is lesser, that becomes a really key relationship because here are the stipulations of the covenant. God lays those conditions out. People will say to God, yes, I will accept that, and then follow it to varying degrees. But the point of Genesis, and I think the point of the whole Bible is, even when humans fail, God is going to maintain the covenant. And that's a big part of this Abraham story too. In particular in Genesis 15, which we didn't talk about in the sermon, but if you read Genesis 15, God once again restates that whole idea of people, land, and promise, blessing that's going to come to Abraham. But in Genesis 15, there's actually a covenant ceremony.
Yes.
Where God tells Abraham to take these pieces of animal, to sacrifice these animals, take the bloody pieces, separate them. The idea in the ancient world was you walk between those bloody pieces as the vassal, as the lesser party, to say, if I don't keep the covenant, may I become like these animals. Yeah. Well, what happens then?
That's powerful.
What happens then is that in that passage in Genesis 15, Abraham does this, and then he goes to sleep, and he has a vision. And in the vision, there is a pot and a flaming torch. Well, think about the representations of God in Exodus leading the Israelites, pillar of fire, the fire on the mountain, all those kinds of things, the burning bush, all those kinds of things.
Right.
So what is that vision? It is God walking through those bloody pieces, saying, I will keep this covenant even when you fail to do so.
Yeah.
But that covenant is going to get repeated over and over again through Abraham, then to Isaac, then to Jacob. It's going to go through Judah. When we get to the end, he becomes the tribal leader from the tribe from which Jesus is going to emerge. It's not Joseph, although Joseph is really critical to the covenant story. We're going to spend all of Lent in the Joseph story. But this idea of covenant is God is working with these human beings to accomplish his purpose, which is what God intended to do from the very beginning of creation.
Yeah, it's really rich and powerful. When you've talked about the Abraham passage with the covenant.
It's often overlooked.
Yeah.
It's often overlooked, but I think it's a really critical passage in Genesis because it does foreshadow what God actually does
Yeah.
in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
He walks through the bloody pieces. He becomes bloody on our behalf. And it's a powerful image that connects back to that, I think is powerful.
You touched on it a little bit, in that talking about the covenant, but you mentioned what exactly does God promise to Abraham in this?
Well, he promises him three things. He promises him land, for one.
Yeah.
He's going to be in a promised land, and that land is going to be essential through the book of Exodus into Joshua, Judges, all the way up through. But then again, when you get toward the end of the Old Testament, you have this idea of exile. Israel's going to be invaded by foreign powers. They're going to be taken off into captivity. That land still is important, but I like to think of this land, and I mentioned this in the sermon.
Yeah.
And if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to go back and watch the sermon from this week.
It'll make more sense.
It'll make a little more sense geographically. But if you think about, as I said in the sermon, if you think about all these empires of the ancient world kind of being rooms in a house, God puts Israel in the hallway. And so their land is not to be a defensible kind of barrier to every other people group. All these people groups are going to be moving through this strip of land on the Mediterranean, on the Eastern Mediterranean. But I think what God intends by giving that particular land to Abraham and then his subsequent generations is that it becomes a launching pad.
Yeah.
From here, God's goodness, the story of God's redemptive work for the whole world is going to launch out from this place.
It's a beautiful image. I mean, when you hear that idea, it's a beacon, it's a signpost. It's as people and cultures are, filtering through from one area to the next, to see God's hand at work in this area, it's incredible. I never thought about that before.
Yeah, when you have the dispersion, for example, during the Babylonian invasion, people are taken off to Babylon. They're scattered in different places. And then you get to the New Testament and you go to the book of Acts, for example, and where is Paul traveling to? He's traveling all around the Mediterranean world, but he's going to Jewish communities first in each one of these places, from Galatia to Ephesus to Corinth, all these places, and connecting with these Jewish communities because there's part of that dispersion. Here again, what is God's mandate at the very beginning of Genesis? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Well, God is doing that with this family. And this land is important because it's the launching place for that to take place.
Amazing. You talked about faith being more than just what we believe and what we know, but that is a total commitment. Faith is a total commitment. And how does Abraham demonstrate that faith? What kind of faith is required for us as brothers and sisters in Christ?
We so often think of faith as simply what we believe.
Yeah.
Here's a set of propositions that I'm going to say that I believe. And we do that on Sunday morning when we do the creeds at our traditional service. We state what we believe. And Abraham is obviously thinking along those lines, but he also does something with it.
Yeah.
The most powerful words in that, just like we talked about Noah, but Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. The key verse in Genesis 12 is Abraham went as the Lord had told him. Without that, you can believe all that stuff.
Yeah.
I believe God, possible to do that. But until he starts walking, that's really what it's about. And I love how Paul puts it in Romans 4. When he's talking about faith, Paul's talking about faith in terms of what is it that makes us part of the family of God. He's writing to an audience that's probably primarily Gentile with some Jews kind of poking over their shoulder. What is it that brings this community of now Gentiles and Jews together as one in the church? And he's saying faith is the common denominator. And he talks about Abraham, the example of Abraham, that before Abraham was circumcised, before there was the law, before there was any of that kind of stuff, Abraham believed God,
Yeah.
started walking, parenthetically, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So his faith was actually a movement. He moved toward God. He obeyed God.
Yeah.
And we miss that so much because we've turned everything. We live in this sort of bifurcated world. We're trained by the Enlightenment to separate our thoughts from our personhood and all those kinds of things. We can intellectually believe something, but do something completely different. We're these bifurcated people. But in the ancient world, the idea was, I'm going to demonstrate that faith by my obedience.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about being a Wesleyan. We see that as being part of this.
Absolutely.
That my response to God, when Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's not merely, thanks God, I really appreciate the fact that you love me. No, you're commanded to love.
Yeah.
And how do I do that? What does Jesus say in John 13? If you love me, you will
Keep my
do what I command. So obedience is God's love language.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's really where faith takes us.
Yeah, it reminds me of Habakkuk 2. Habakkuk.
Yeah,
I
say
can
that three
say
times
that.
fast.
I can say it, I promise.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. And I've said it.
Faithfulness, not merely intellectual faith.
Exactly. I've said it before in service. The church is wonderful. We get opportunities to connect and build relationships with people who are all on this faith journey together. And I know that I need that personally, to have that rubbing shoulders and being able to pray the same prayers and be in the same room as people who have walked the road that I've walked. But the church itself is a front door. It's a beautiful waiting room for God to begin his good work in people. It really requires us to be willing to take the next step of faith, just asking God, I want to hear your voice. I want to hear what you want me to do, and then beginning to walk that. And that is really discipleship. That is really sanctification. That is really faith and trust and moving with God.
Well, I think you're bringing up something important, and that is that it's not merely an individual pursuit. That's the other thing that we do. We individualize faith where it's really collective.
Yeah.
It's really the fact that we need a community to do that. God is creating a family, not simply a collection of individuals. These family members are all connected generationally, from one generation to the next, relationally within one another.
Yeah.
All of that is important. So he's not just simply working with individuals, he's working with a larger family.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about Abraham, but Abraham needed Sarah. Right?
Yeah.
Without Sarah, none of this would be
and then the
possible.
children and all that. All of this plays into it. So the Genesis really blows up a lot of our preconceived Western notions that faith is simply an individual pursuit where I believe something and therefore I'm in.
And this is a very Wesleyan idea too. Methodism there's a purpose behind the way in which Methodism exists.
Yeah, we want to help people to be shaped into the people God made them to be. And there's a vocation that's part of that.
Yeah.
It's not merely you get to go to heaven when you die. Good for you. So as one of my seminary professors said, if that's all the Bible is about, why is it so thick?
Right.
Why does Jesus spend so much time telling people how they should live?
What is abundant life?
Why does Paul spend all this time telling people what the Christian life looks like? If it's not something that really is our response to this grace that God has given to us.
Yeah.
And if we fail to respond, are we really people of faith?
I know.
We're not at that point. So Abraham went as the Lord told him, and I think that's our call too, to go where God calls us to go.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it a little bit before, talking about the family, and of course, the family of God being a part of a community. Why do you think God decided to launch his rescue project, so to speak, through a family?
Because it's a communal project, and God himself is family. If you think of the Trinity in that way, that God's own personhood, right from the very beginning, let us make humankind in our image.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is God's community and unity. And I think that carries over into how God is going to work with these human beings. He creates them male and female. He creates them for a community with each other, to be fruitful and multiply, all of that. So God is working with people, even though they're flawed, even though they're broken, God doesn't give up on the project. And I think that's to the point at which, spoiler alert, God comes in person
Right.
as a human being in Jesus Christ. Here's the perfect image of God. And what does he immediately do? Does Jesus need to have 12 disciples? Good question. I think it's right in line with what God's been doing from the very beginning.
Yeah. And we see, of
He's
course,
drawing
the 12
together a
disciples,
family.
12 tribes of Israel.
And he's redefining what family means. I mean, think about the image when Jesus is in the house at Capernaum and is teaching, and his mother and brothers and sisters come down to try to get him because they think he's lost his mind. And mom's outside the house and says, "Hey, tell my boy his mom's outside." I'm paraphrasing, but Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?"
Yeah.
Those who do the will of my Father. So there, here again, that obedience component is part of this. What makes you part of the family? And that's the key. How are you part of the family? When we do baptism, it's about being part of the family. When we bring in new members like we did this week, it's about being part of the family.
Yeah.
And not just our local church family, but the larger body of Christ. So we're designed for that communal approach.
Absolutely.
And we miss that when we individualize everything.
Because it's one, it's for us to be able to learn, to grow, to be edified, to become more like him, and for us to be able to demonstrate and exercise the work of the Spirit that God is developing within us.
Yeah. We have to do it together. Yeah.
So what's coming up next?
Well, this week we're going to start into the Jacob saga.
That's awesome.
We're going to be looking at Isaac is kind of an interesting figure. We have all this run up to having Isaac. And there's the stories about Isaac. You know, he marries Rebekah. There's the great story Abraham wants to get him a wife, but not from among the Canaanites. So they send an emissary back to Haran, back to their people, and there's this great story about the servant of Abraham coming to a well and praying to God, show me the woman who gives me a drink. That's going to be the bride for.
That's wild.
I'm going to bring back for Isaac.
It's the sign.
Yeah, I mean, so much for dating, right? Why bother? Just who's showing up at the well? That's what we're looking for.
Right.
But there's it's a great love story. She comes back and she sees him in the distance, and there's this kind of connection. And it's a beautiful biblical love story.
It is.
And then they have twins, Jacob and Esau. But Isaac, you'd think after all this run up, he's going to have a much bigger role. He's really just kind of the bridge to get to Jacob, because there's so much more about Jacob, who becomes Israel. That's his name changes. From heel grabber to Israel. We're going to talk about that this week.
With God.
But the story of the origins of that, Jacob and Esau, what happens with Jacob as he escapes and he's on the run, and then ultimately he has the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. But then we get into the real family story that's going to wrap Genesis up, and that's the Joseph story. So the next 3 weeks are going to be in the Jacob story. And then for Lent, we're going to get into the story of Joseph. And one of the things we're going to do for Lent is we're really looking forward to having some home study groups. We're going to be using the podcast to kind of help supplement that. We've got questions and all kinds of things. So if you're interested in putting together a home study group, and not only if you're part of Aldersgate, but anywhere you happen to be watching this, we would encourage you to think about putting together a home study group, watch the sermons. You can watch the podcast, listen to the podcast. We'll provide you with a leader's guide. You can gather a few people together and just talk through this important text. I think the Joseph story is such a typology. It's a typology of Jesus. It's a typology of kingship. All these things come together. He's kind of a prefiguring of what a messianic figure will look like. And it's such an important story, particularly as it, in many ways, brings Genesis full circle.
Yeah.
What is God's goodness, the goodness that God intended from the beginning? How is that going to be worked through flawed human beings? And Joseph demonstrates one of the ways that it can be done. And through forgiveness and through reconciliation and all those kinds of things.
Redemption.
It's a marvelous, marvelous story. So we're going to be taking some time to dive into that. So I'm really excited about going through the rest of this series, and we hope you'll join us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this edition of the Aldersgate Experience. We'll see you back here next week. We'll be talking about Jacob and Esau as we look at whether it's about blessing or about a bowl of soup. We'll see you then.